We've had the opportunity to share a ton of great stories, a whole journey of different curated car stories and some of my personal stories and a few of my dad's stories. The one thing we haven't talked too much about is my grandfather and his journey. And I think it's such a great story to tell because it really is a testament to sort of my work ethic, the concept of never giving up, and really a guy that understood cars to an incredible level and was an incredible engineer. My grandfather was born in Syria in the 1920s. I believe it was 1927. Historical record keeping in Syria wasn't too great in that period. And he was born as basically a Christian Armenian in crazy times in Syria. And at a young age, like 12 or 14 years old, he actually basically was involved in basically some civil war and some war that was happening in Kasab, Syria. He ended up becoming, I guess you could call it almost like a spy. It was like a translator that was working with the French Foreign Legion, and the French Foreign Legion actually had sort of, I guess you could say, troops or whatever in Syria at that time. And unfortunately, he got involved in a situation where he had to actually flee Syria and flee the country. There were some generals after him and he had to leave his family. He joined the French Foreign Legion, imagine well under 18 years old, and he went fighting around the world. I know at one point he was in Morocco, he went all over Africa, all over the Middle East, and finally ended up settling in Marseille, France. I'm gonna guess 1952 and 1953, he hears some Armenian people speaking, and ironically enough, he is shocked to see that there's other Armenians like him in Marseille, France, and that's when he meets my grandmother. They get married, and they have my father, and in 1957 moved to, of all places, Springfield, Massachusetts, United States. So at the time, my grandfather was an incredible worker in the sense that at one point he was working on plane engines, and then he was a truck driver, and he was doing all these odd jobs to make it in the US. I believe he came here with about $500, $600 in actually gold coins. That was how they traveled, and that's what they came over with. And he arrived in Massachusetts and started working at a gas station. He started working for a service facility that I think was called Springfield Sports Cars. And eventually, they lived in a one-tenement house and saved up enough money to basically buy a former gas station service center. That became Medical Center Garage. Why? It was actually next to the Medical Center building in Springfield. And I think if you look at photos, and this is sort of the interesting part, you could see just how hard he worked and the progression of his life. You look at photos in the late 50s, early 60s, and you could tell they didn't have money. I mean, unfortunately, they were in probably dire straits, and you know, I don't think he ever really talked about that period. But then you start to see as his business grew, and you'd start seeing my grandmother wearing a fur, and you'd start to see him in a beautiful suit. And at one point, and I still have it to this day, I think it was in 65 or 66, he bought a Breitling Navitimer. So, you know, you could see how he started to make money and save, and he bought a house, and a beautiful house. During this time, and really unbeknownst to him, and I would say even until his passing, he didn't realize the significance, he was working on primarily all European cars. You know, MGs, Jaguars, Rolls-Royce, Ferrari, and the caliber of cars he was working on was absolutely incredible. I mean, we're talking Jaguar D-Types, Ferrari 250 short wheelbase, and in this process, he was buying and selling cars as well. So some of his clients included the Blake brothers, who were Friendly's Ice Cream, the famous Friendly's ice cream chain. Another collector, Robert Sowers, Bob Sowers, he had a beautiful Jaguar E-Type. He actually had And it's funny, I don't even think my grandfather knew it or Robert Sowers knew it, but he actually owned Ferrari chassis number 2. For many years, that was a rebodied car, and it looked more like a later 60s race car, but he had that car, and my grandfather used to service it. He had and we've talked about this before, a 250 GTO that my grandfather sold or brokered to him, or basically did a deal, and I don't know if it was to Robert Sowers or to the next owner, but he ended up selling, imagine, a 250 GTO for like $6,800. So he was working on some of the best cars in the world. He was servicing some of the best cars in the world, and really a testament to the American dream. He moved into one of the best neighborhoods in Longmeadow, Springfield. So at this point, my father was a young man and he had gotten bitten by cars, and my grandfather was just this incredible spirit and soul. He was a wild guy. He drove motorcycles. When he would take out a Lamborghini or a Ferrari, he would drive it to probably the point of no return. I mean, he was speed shifting, and he was a tough guy. And he told my dad, he goes, you know, if you work for me and you're good in school and you get good grades, I'll buy you whatever car you want. So this is the late 60s, and really at that time my grandfather had, I think one of his first sports cars was an XK150, which was a very cool car at that time, and he traded that for an XKE, and then he bought a Ferrari. And I think at one point he had a white Ferrari 275 GTB, which would have been so cool back in period. And my dad wanted a Lamborghini Miura. So imagine at 16 years old, my dad's first car was a Miura P400. I believe it was a red car. And then my grandfather and him, they sold that, and he bought a Chartreuse Miura S, and then later sold that again for a metallic red Miura S. And imagine at that point, I mean, now thinking those cars were $10,000 or $15,000 or $20,000, but back then that was a lot of money. And to me, my grandfather was never obsessed or truly passionate about the cars like my father became, and like my father still is today. But it really is a testament to his hard work, his work ethic, and building something from nothing. His true talent, and talking to people that knew him and worked with him, was really, he was an amazing engineer. So it was really remarkable because he had this amazing talent for making something out of nothing. A spare part, you know, he could take a fork or a spoon and he could duplicate it perfectly, deciphering all mechanicals and gears, and really a man's man. I mean, he was the type of guy that he always had a cigarette in his hand, he drank scotch, so he was part of a generation that was just tough as nails. I mean, he was a man's man, and unfortunately, it's sort of a crazy story, but funny, he actually broke his back because he was trying to pick up a engine block, I believe it was from an MG or something like that, and had to retire at an early age. And looking back, I mean, really what he did was he instilled an incredible work ethic, and also a sense of this concept of not giving up and chasing your dreams. And I remember vividly, he never really looked at cars as, he looked at cars as, this is something he must get in, drive hard, and have fun with it, which is the exact opposite of my dad, who's very OCD, as we've talked about before. So it's really special to me now when I meet collectors or people that knew him, and I can share these stories and share some incredible photos. A few years ago, I was looking at a Countach up in Massachusetts, and I actually went back to his old facility and I took a few photos. And it's something that's brought me to where I am today. It's brought the company, and it's inspired the company to where we are. And it really allowed my father to pursue his passion and pursue his dreams. I don't think there's many 16-year-olds that came from a hardworking parent that were allowed the opportunity of working themselves, getting good grades, and then having the result of this. And he taught my dad that work ethic, and my dad ended up becoming, working very hard and buying another Miura and working even harder, and eventually buying his Miura SV. So It's a story that I wanted to share with you guys. It's much more than cars, and I think it's an inspiration, especially in times like these.